when I was there, I heard somebody saying this is amazing because this is like the only place where this is happening. And I thought, wait a minute, no, this isn't the only place where this is happening, because there are many other standing rocks in the US, and there are many other standing rocks in all over the Americas.
All right, Rising Man family, I've got another amazing guest joining me here today. Today I've got Ivan Sawyer, also known as Ivan Kushansum, coming in live from Tepoztlan, Mexico. Good to see you, bro. Nice to meet you. Thanks for being on the show.
Hey, really good to be here, brother. Thanks for having me. What an honor and pleasure.
Quick shout out to my sister, Maya Casilda, who connected us for the first time. And what I love about having you as a guest on here, Ivan, is when I'll share this because nobody else will know this conversation. When I first reached out to you and said, hey, I'd love to have you as a guest on the show, you said, well, I don't really know much about men's work. I'm not really involved in it, but I'll come on but I'm not sure what I'm going to share. And I thought that was so perfect because the main qualifier is that you're a man having an experience on this planet with a lot of really amazing work to share and an experience that will be valuable. And so I wanted to say that because I think it's also important. A lot of times people come on this show and they already have a reference for this work and this world. And I actually think that your perspective is even more valuable because it's a little bit from outside of that bubble, you know?
All right. Well, let's see how it goes. I'm happy to be here and honored. And I've been listening to some of the episodes of the show, and I'm finding really interesting, the people that you bring on, and happy to be here.
All right. Well, if you've been listening to the show, then you saw this one coming a mile away. The first question is, what does it mean to be a man?
What does it mean to be a man? Let's see. I guess it's something that I'm still figuring out. We are taught something by society, by culture, and even though I didn't grow up in a very formal, traditional Catholic, because here in Mexico, it's a very Catholic country and very macho culture and so on. And I do feel that we have a lot of programming around what it is to be a man, but there are many definitions to what it is to be a man, and everyone defines in a different way. And even now today with the gender variants and so on, it doesn't even define as being born with a penis, because so there's men that weren't born with penis. So I guess a man is what you decided to be and what a man makes it.
I love that answer, man. That's definitely the orientation that I've come to with, and why I ask that question every time, because I think it is such a very personal definition. Oftentimes there's a lot of overlap for certain people when it comes to what is my definition of being a man. But I think it's important that we don't create one acceptable category or distinct definition of what manhood is. Otherwise, it doesn't leave room for people, like you said, who identify as a man, but not by the traditional standards or by the standards that we were raised in. So growing up in Mexico, I want to ask you, what were some of the examples of what it meant to be a man that you saw, that you witnessed, that was part of that culture you were raised in growing up, that you no longer subscribe to, you no longer associate with what it means to be a man? And maybe you've even had to unlearn that being part of what manhood is as you become an adult.
Yeah, well, I wasn't raised, like I said, in a very traditional family, and there were expectations around what it was to be a boy, what it was to be a man, what a man was supposed to do, be like, behave like, not like. But I think I really didn't subscribe to a lot of things very young. Mm-hmm. And I do still need to go, we continuously need to uncondition ourselves. But so your question is, what are things that I was maybe programmed to believe that I am deconditioning myself around being a man? I guess, there's a lot that has to do with the male leadership, that it's the man that has to lead, that it's the man that has to decide, that it's the man that has to pay, the bill. And although I there's some of those things that may come from our own, will or want to as men, I think we want to be sometimes the caretakers and be generous in the way we are, but it has to come from a place of really wish of sharing and not of wish of domination. And there is, I think you probably talk about this in a lot of the programs, but has to do with this patriarchal way of thinking. And I think we really still need to deprogram ourselves. And me, as I'm almost 40 years old. I think even though I didn't grow up in a very traditional family, I still have a lot of that programming in me, and have to believe in ways that still need to deconstruct and see that, men and women and other genders, we need to walk together, not one in front of the other, not one on top of the other. And I think that Mexican macho culture does say or does show, try and teach us that, no, it's the man that needs to dominate, and it's the man that needs to, and we see that in everywhere, in organizations and politics, where it is mostly men that lead, and I think that even though I feel there's a lot of resistance into the feminist movement from males, and I don't know if that's the same in the US, but it's not. We can't deny that we've never had a woman president in the history in Mexico, and I think in the US, as well. So there are unbalances, and it does come from this patriarchal belief that maybe men are better, or men have had more opportunities, and that's men have more opportunities in those places, and I think there is a time for adjustment, and that we can walk together. And it's not saying that men do, that now women have to lead, but no, I think that we can walk together, and I'm really inspired to be in a world where we can walk together as men, women, and other genders, and not as necessarily men being the one that dominates or leads.
Likewise,
as we were taught.
Yeah, likewise. And I think it's fair to say, I don't think many people would argue that a lot of that patriarchal mindset of the men being the ones who lead comes from the colonial influence. Even the Europeans who came across the ocean to settle on these shores, that it was men. Like these were missions and initiatives that were launched and led by men. And so naturally, the overtaking of one culture over the other, infusing its culture into the people who are living here. Because my understanding is that in the Americas, in the land that we now modern times call the Americas, there weren't the same social structures. It was, like you said, more men and women walking in tandem, or even matriarchal societies where women were the quote unquote chiefs, making ultimate decisions for the people on behalf of the people. But I think the difference is that everyone had a very clear role. And I don't know what you believe, but I think a lot of the resistance that may come with like you said, the feminist movement, or men who are afraid that what happens if we relinquish some of the power and authority that's been nurtured and conquered for over many, many generations, is that, well, what will our function and purpose be if not to serve in this role? I think a lot of I keep saying the word traditional. I think I need to find a better word than traditional right now in this context. The typical structures we see in Western societies, modern Western societies, has, like you said, male presidents, right? Men serving in political office, men serving as the leaders of corporations and organizations. And even though it's shifting now, there's still largely the expectation. And I think there's a lot of men, and especially the ones who are in resistance to change, are afraid deep down, well, what would happen to me if I'm no longer the leader? If I'm not in a position of authority, what would that mean for me? What are your thoughts on that perspective?
I think there is a lot of fear and a resistance, and I've seen in the last few years a lot of the rise of the feminist movement, and also here in Mexico, and how there is a lot of resistance, and even sometimes burla. How do you say? They laugh upon. I see this male reaction on social media where they are laughing and they are insulting and they are like almost saying, oh, like why would they believe we are equal, almost like, or why would or what are they complaining about, as if this structure was also chosen by women, and I guess that's also true because there's a lot of explanations about how patriarchy is also maintained by women, and that's also something that needs to. Patriarchy is not only maintained and imposed by men; it is also maintained and imposed by women. But women speaking out about injustices, I think, there is a reaction sometimes coming from the scared, wounded masculine saying that doesn't want to, that is. Reacts in a sort of way that does not give credit to this balance seeking energy, because I see it as an energy seeking balance in the world, that the feminist movement isn't only about women, it's also about finding more balance. And so they're saying, oh, then feminist, then what's the opposite of feminist, why as if this was a movement seeking separation, like the Black Lives Matter. It's like, oh, well, white lives matter too, and blue lives matter, and so on. But no, it's because when there is an imbalance, we need to address that. And Black Lives Matter is not only Black people in that movement, and feminist movement isn't only for women. It's about coming together to find more of those balances. At least that's how I see it. And
Yeah, I love your perspective, Ivan, and I was hoping you could speak a little bit more on your upbringing, because when I asked you that question, you said, I wasn't raised in a traditional. It sounded like a traditional Mexican upbringing that's would represent more of what we've just been speaking about. But what was your upbringing like, and how did that influence you? How did that lead you down your path?
Yeah, I said I'm not a very traditional. I come from a mixed background. My father is American born. California. My mother is Mexican. They both came from Catholic families, but they were already from the hippie era, that they had already, were seeking out of traditional society, and very young had, become spiritual seekers and environmentalists. And I grew up in a small town south of Mexico City called Tepoztlan. My parents arrived here about 40 years ago. They weren't exactly hippies, but they were, of that generation seeking, like I said, out of traditional society. They met down here in Mexico. They were in a spiritual path together that is called the Fourth Way, that comes out of Gurdjieff, a teacher from Europe, Russia, actually, that is a philosophy of a way of life, of what they call the work, which has to do with bringing attention and consciousness into our life and our daily life, and our and different spiritual practices that are not religious but have to do with consciousness and being conscious of different areas of our lives, is the best way I can describe it right now. But anyway, I didn't grow up Catholic. I'm the only person, I guess, in my entire family on both sides that wasn't even baptized. And in Mexico, that's really rare to have somebody that wasn't baptized by the church. I still had aunties telling me that I was going to go to hell and that I needed to be baptized. And so that's very rare in Mexican society. And my parents weren't very traditional in the sense that we grew up in a community that was very, in a small town, kind of like other families, similar kind of hippie kids. They had our school, and they many were vegetarian. So many of our parents were spiritual seekers, very active politically, environmentalists, artists. So
let me jump in for just a second, because I love this part of your backstory. I think that so my parents and your parents are of the same generation, right? Maybe your parents are slightly older than mine. But my parents were flower children in the 60s and the 70s, growing up, free love, exploring all that. But I think most people who lived through the 60s and 70s that way, a lot of them went there and then they retracted and they kind of corrected and came back to more of what was acceptable in society. And I think folks like your parents, they kind of squeaked through the membrane, right? Like they made it past the resistance point and actually started living their lives that way, more than just going to Woodstock and, taking psychedelics and smoking weed and partying for a while. They actually kept going because my parents, they both had their experiences of the 60s and 70s, but eventually they came back to suburban lifestyle, nuclear family, 9-to-5 job. My dad worked in corporate for, 35 years. And just hearing that, I think of it as you're like a generation ahead, right? Because for me and my friends our mutual friends, Emiliano, Maya, our families are trying to create that for our children now. So it's almost like I'm in the position that your parents were in, and I'm looking at you saying, okay, that's where I hope my children would be. I just wanted to highlight that because it's like, oh, okay. So because I believe that it's a lot of distance to cover to break out of the, religious dogma of society. If a lot of us have been brought up in that, especially for multiple generations, on top of the, the ideas of having a nuclear family and living separate in separate dwellings and not really interacting with your neighbors so much, the ideas of convenience and participating in the social machine. It's a lot to go from that to what your parents were doing and what you were raised in, right?
Yeah, totally. So, what else? So yeah, I kind of like what I meant with non-traditional upbringing is that I grew up in a space where freedom was encouraged, where non-traditional values were encouraged, though where, we were not put in boxes and really raised in a way where you can create the world you imagine, and you can explore your own selves in different way, and it doesn't matter that you don't fit in society, because society is leading us the wrong direction anyway. My father was from the Vietnam War generation. He escaped the draft. He was involved in the civil rights movement. So I feel I had values in my family that were all about, understanding and incorporating different ways of being and accepting and being tolerant to different cultures and values. And I think that I have that very strong in me, that in the sense that, I accept and value diversity above everything, and really, really value that diversity. And that's, I hold that very strongly as part of the values that I want to hold and share in all the work that I do, is valuing diversity and not trying to one worldview dominate over the other, but really be accepting of different ways of being. That I think that's something that I hold strongly.
Yeah. Well, kudos to your parents for raising you in that way and figuring out how to do it. It's certainly, I think a lot of people would call that an alternative lifestyle in comparison to the norm. And I'm interested because obviously, like I said, it's very personal for me. That's a big part of my vision and mission, is to raise my children in more of an alternative fashion, closer to what you described your experience of growing up as. Obviously, I think a lot of us will sometimes idealize that way of raising children and only see the obvious benefits of it. I wonder, were there any costs to being raised that way? As you look back, was there anything that you missed out on, or anything that ended up being a challenge for you as you made your way into adulthood?
Yeah, well, actually, it's a good question that you ask. We lived in a ranch, in a very rural ranch, where I was younger for a few years. I have an older sister, and when we went back to our other town where we were, and we had this like a school, for alternative school. My sister didn't want to go to the alternative school. She said, I just want to go to the normal school, Mom. And she went to the normal public school in town. And as we grew up, and I think a lot of kids in my community as well, that coming out of this alternative education and then going to normal high school or college was very difficult, because we were not used to those expectations and those values. And, when we hit high school and college, it is like the rest of the world. You want to make money, you want to fit certain standards in society that weren't really the standards that we were raised. And I think it was hard for a lot of kids in my generation to go bust the bubble of the that we grew up in, and to find success in the normal world. And for example, I ended up not going to college, so I didn't have a formal university. And in that moment, I was like, I want to travel, and I worked, and I did other things. But now I look back and I kind of wish I had a formal education, which I'm still lacking in. So the total freedom had little structure in which to make and then that becomes like an issue later on. And for example, my sister, she broke out of the bubble really young and pursued a completely different way of living. She went to normal college, got a master's degree, worked for the United Nations. Now, I guess a lot of the same values, but into the mainstream world, where she definitely does not keen at all into the hippie lifestyle or the, she's just, and many of the people that grew up in our community, they're sometimes going to extremes, the children of hippies sometimes become the most mainstream normal people you would ever imagine. Is what I'm trying to say. It's not because you grow up in this way that you usually seek completely opposite of the way that you grew up. So in that sense, there's many things in the way that we were raised that may kind of, you sometimes feel abnormal, and that's kind of uncomfortable when you go to college and school, and you want to be normal. You don't want to be the weird kid. You don't want to be the one that stands out, and that creates I think. But it goes both ways, so like you say, there are some downsides and there are some upside. Everybody's like, oh, it's so cool, you grew up like this, and sometimes I'm like, sometimes I just wish I grew up in a normal family in the city.
Totally. Well,
I actually don't, but
no, I know. And I think it's important to acknowledge. I appreciate your perspective on it. And it's actually really interesting how you have the contrast between your experience and your sister's to look at, because it's a good demonstration that there's costs to everything. Even raising our children in this idealized version of what it looks like to be removed from society and unplugged from screens. I've worked with a lot of homeschooled children, a lot of young boys and teens who've been homeschooled their whole lives, and they have a very difficult time, like you said, adapting to and participating in the more conventional social structures, especially when they have to get into high school and college, like you said. And so it's good to note that it's not all gravy, right? It doesn't all end up working out. And I wonder, what do you think is the best way to have the best of both worlds, right? How do we find that balance of raising our kids in alternative ways so they don't get swept up into this greater machine of society, but also still able to participate in it, right? Like speak the language and be engaged with people at that level.
Yeah, well, it's a fine line to walk, and I don't know the answer. I see that. Say I don't have kids yet, and many of my friends that have kids, and I think that I really think that growing up in nature is important, and living. I think that I spent a lot of time in nature growing up, and I see the where I live. I mean, not everybody has the opportunity, of course, to be in a place, in contact with nature, in contact with art, with creativity, encouraging art and creativity in children, encouraging them to explore themselves and explore the way that they want to express themselves in the world, and really be very, very promoting that sort of growth in kids, and not cutting off their creativity. And I think it's hard now with technology and people, being addicted to phones and iPads and all of that. But, we have to really find ways in which in which children can grow in a much more free environment. And I think that there's probably educational tools and spaces, and even in urban areas. I want to think of those people that are listening and that are in urban areas, but are looking for ways to raise their kids more in contact with nature and more in contact with art and creating community. And it's really hard with this whole COVID time where kids have been stuck inside and just I can really see how hard it has been for kids and for parents raising kids in this COVID era. No. And I don't know. I don't know what to say, but yeah. Nature, art.
I hear you. Well, let's pivot a little bit more into your work in this world. It's been so nice hearing about your upbringing and the values that were instilled and the way that you were raised. Would you identify yourself as a filmmaker, a photographer when you tell people what you do? Because I didn't even ask before we started.
Yeah, I'm a photographer. I'm a media creator. I'm an activist. I studied photography and visual arts, and I have done that throughout most of my life. I created a multimedia platform that is called Voices of Amerikua, that is sharing the voices of Indigenous people of Central, North, and South America, and their different struggles and ways of protecting land, of protecting their culture and their rights. So this media platform, I've collaborated with several documentaries, produced several documentaries, and we also help create and lead social media campaigns around these issues, online and offline as well. And yeah, so it's a platform I created. It's voicesofameriqua.net. The name Amerikua comes from an ancient name of the continent, America. We usually learn that the name America comes from Americo Vespucius, who was the first man that mapped the continent. But there were some researchers that found that there was an ancient name from the continent, which was also called Turtle Island for North America. Abiyala is another name that the continent has been named in another indigenous language. And Amerikua, which seems that was a name given to the continent by an indigenous tribe that used to live in Nicaragua, which is in Central America. And they had a Mayan dialect in which they named the continent Amerikua, which means place of the four winds. So I heard that many years ago. I don't actually know if it's completely true or not, but I have found bibliography and researchers that actually claim, but I was looking for a name that symbolized the union of the Americas, because I have a bicultural background and bilingual background, and I've traveled extensively in South America, and I always was seeing how there were parallels in the indigenous movements of the North and indigenous movements of the South. I was during my growing up, I also was very influenced by the Zapatista movements and the indigenous movements here in Mexico, in Chiapas, and I was inspired to see how we could use media as a way to bridge movements of the North and of the South. And the kind of like this eagle condor vision, and how how there needed to be more this bridge, so that people in the North could see and support what was happening in the South, and people in the South could see and support what was going on in the North. And that's how I came up with the idea of this media platform, and then of the name Amerikua, which for me was a way to bridge that the continent, to see us as an entire continent. It's not only Turtle Island in the North. It's not only North America. It's not only South America. It's the Americas. It includes Central America as well. And we are one big, huge continent that goes all the way from Alaska to the South, from South America to Patagonia, and that vision of a unified continent is something that has inspired me, and see how we are much more than these political borders, because political borders is something that was brought by colonialism as well, and that we created these countries but before these countries, there are a lot of indigenous nations that have been there way before these political borders, and transcend these political borders, because many indigenous nations are actually between different countries. They belong in different countries. So seeing how geography and language are there as maps before our political maps brought. And so I've always been exploring about how media and digital media as well, and arts, can be a way of sharing these voices of the Americas, these voices of the indigenous people of the Americas that are not ancient voices. They are voices that are alive today, that are still alive in many parts of the continent, and that we as non-indigenous people also belong to, because now it's not only the indigenous people, but it's the settlers that have come and the other cultures that have been come from Africa as well, and we have blended together to create a new culture. The culture, the rainbow culture, which is called in many other, and which is the blending of many different nations and the Asians as well. So we all have come together. America has been a melting pot of all the cultures of the world that have come together and created new cultures as well. So, but to create a new culture, we have to really take and understand and consider what has come before us. And consider the who are the original keepers and original guardians of our lands. And I think that, to really, it's about that. It's about listening to the ancient voices and going forward with that understanding and respect for who has been here before. Because, I'm not indigenous. We call here mestizo, is a mixture of European blood with mostly European blood and some maybe indigenous blood somewhere. So as mestizos, as non-indigenous people, as white, maybe white people, how can we be good allies to our indigenous brothers and sisters who are still alive and who have many issues and many struggles to protect the land that is theirs and is ours as well. But we have to be more as allies. So this has been part of my ongoing research and work, and that has led me to create Voices of Amerikua.
Yeah. Well, I love that conversation, because I myself have ancestry that's not from this land. At least 2 generations back, my grandparents and some great grandparents came from other parts of the world and then came here. But I was born here. I was born in New Jersey, right outside New York City. My DNA came into existence on this land. And obviously that's the story for so many people, just like yourself as well. So that it's important to have this other narrative. I think there's the prevailing narrative that, well, since we've come from other places and this land doesn't belong to us, we weren't the original custodians, our people, my ancestors were not the original custodians of this land, that I will forever not belong here, that I will forever have to live with this guilt and shame that comes from my people. And obviously, the acknowledgement, the recognition, the reverence for what happened when our peoples came from other parts of the world and took these lands, and all of the atrocities that came in the colonial period that's still ongoing. Obviously, not to disregard any of that, but to also have this dialogue of, well, what does it look like? We're here now, right? And we can't undo any of those things that have happened. And what are the possibilities for us to actually live and coexist as this rainbow people, as this mixed people, giving deserved recognition and reverence and respect to the peoples who have been here for the longest period of time, who know this land the best, who still have traditions and customs and stories preserved from their ancestors and relatives, but also to be able to partake in an honoring of this land that we come from, that we literally were, my whole life, I've been consuming plants and animals that are from this land. I've been becoming part of this land. And then, I like to look at it from that perspective, because otherwise I think there's this perpetual foreigner. I'm not deserving of even being here. There's got to be a way to be in that relationship. I wonder what your perspective is, because it's a difficult conversation to have. It's so much easier to say, you know what, it was all bad. Everything that happened here. And that's the only story that will ever exist. I think there's got to be something that we all decide to move into together that creates a new possibility for us moving forward.
Yeah, well, it's definitely a difficult conversation to have. And part of it comes from just recognizing, without guilt, but recognizing, the history. And the problem is when you try to erase history and say like, oh, okay, like as if nothing had happened, and say, oh, can't we just, start again from zero and pretend that nothing happened? And actually we can't. And I think that first is that, there's a lot of, in not so much in the US, but in Canada, this whole work about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and the work also in Latin America has to do with first understanding history and really learning about history, wanting to learn about history, and not wanting to close the door on things just because they're painful and just because they're uncomfortable, because there is a lot of that. I think the white guilt has to do with not talking about things and not addressing them because they're uncomfortable. And so that starts with that. And then right relationship also has to do with honoring and recognizing whose land you are in. So I can't really talk about this because I'm not from the US, but what I've been learning in the past few years has to do with right relationship, has to do with recognizing whose land you are in, and then maybe creating and supporting community spaces. I mean, for those that are interested in engaging in right relationship and decolonizing work, it does have to do with learning what's around, what the names of things are in the original language, what ways we can give back to communities that still are alive, and being allies of movements that are alive today, that are seeking land back, or that are seeking at least the protection of sacred lands, territories, rivers, because many indigenous people today are defenders and actively, protect their mountain, their river. And so looking away doesn't help. It is saying this is, and that's kind of what Voices of Amerikua was created about, was to help share these stories and these movements and ways in which people can engage and support. And, this was a few years before Standing Rock movement. And I think everybody, heard about Standing Rock and became an international thing. And that's why I believe Standing Rock movement was such an important moment, because it was of bringing together indigenous and non-indigenous people together for that fight, which happened there, and it brought a lot of attention. And I went to Standing Rock, and when I was there, I heard somebody saying, this is amazing because this is like the only place where this is happening. And I thought, wait a minute, no, this isn't the only place where this is happening, because there are many other Standing Rocks in the US, and there are many other Standing Rocks in all over the Americas. But what was so important about Standing Rock is that made that wave of movement and brought so many people together in solidarity in that moment. And it really was amazing. Unfortunately, they weren't able to stop the pipeline in that place, but there are many other pipelines that have been before and after. And the call is to actively support, the movements that are there to protect our water, to protect our mountains, to protect our rivers. And as indigenous and non-indigenous people, we all belong to the land where we were born. So that I think that it is important to come together more and to erase those barriers of race and culture, and recognize each other's all as earth keepers, or earth guardians, planetary guardians, and listen to those that were here before us and that can maybe lead the way, but then come together. Because when we come in respect, the people there at Standing Rock and other movements are very welcoming of non-indigenous people to come and support, but not in the way that, oh, we know better, or leading the way, and then once then we can create a more movements together.
Yeah, it brings up something I don't think I've ever shared on the podcast here before, but I imagine that other people have a similar experience. And in the conversation of decolonization, and also this conversation of putting an end to patriarchal structures in our society, as a man, I find that there's a lot of this experience that I don't know exactly what my role is. I don't know what to do to make things better. And it could be, and fill in the blank conversation, right? There's so many different initiatives that are trying to make our society better and move us in a positive direction. But one of the things that I experience is, it's just like with children. Like when I observe my kids playing, and I see my son do something that, maybe they're playing a little bit rough, and he pushes his friend, and his friend falls down and gets hurt. You could see the process that my son goes through. He kind of recognizes, I did something that injured my friend, and now my friend feels sad. And because my friend feels sad, there's an opportunity for him to connect to the humanity, to empathize with his friend's experience. And it doesn't always happen this way because they're children. But when you can see remorse happen in a child and they learn what remorse feels like, and then he can check on his friend and he can acknowledge, I'm sorry I did that. It's a beautiful thing. But let's bring it back to what I was saying before, when we're talking about colonization, I wasn't here when a lot of this stuff happened. Like the stories that we're talking about acknowledging and paying respect to, because I wasn't here, and I wasn't the human who did that directly. It's difficult to go through that same process that my son would go through when he, pushes his friend down and he gets hurt. So I think there's like this natural disconnect that we experience because it's something that happened when we were never here. I've still experienced it on more of a spiritual or energetic plane, feeling the effects of what happened because decisions that were made by my ancestors or by people who came before me. But it's to me, it's a little bit different than actually having done those things myself in my life. And so it requires us to tap into something a little bit different. It requires that, like you said, we take the time to consider and reflect and think about the stories and understand the stories of what happened. Really sit down with people who have a different version of the narrative that happened before any of us were alive, before any of us were actually here, to pay respect to that, to really understand it and not just go into this guilty place. I think that's the other side of the spectrum. We think, well, then I just need to feel guilty about that, and that's going to somehow make it better, because that doesn't actually get anywhere. To me, that's just a pit stop on the road to a solution. But actually understanding it, feeling whatever we feel, and seeing how we could improve the experience of all beings on this planet moving forward, right? I think there's something about that I think is important to acknowledge.
Yeah. Well, you made me really think there. I think definitely guilt is not the way. In Mexico, we also have a lot of this that has to do with our colonial culture in which many of us were brought up. I mean, in Mexico, just general mainstream culture still promotes patriarchy and racism and colonialism, so it's so let's not live in guilt, but let's not be perpetuators of neocolonialism. So that's where a lot of deep deconstruction has to happen, because sometimes there's unconscious neocolonialism and unconscious patriarchy that we are perpetuating. And I don't know the solution to that. I think that there's a lot of work that has to do that with like self-development. Deep ecology is one stream of work that maybe there's a lot of different work that we can do to deconstruct these types of things that we sometimes unconsciously perpetuate. And that goes as for patriarchy, as it goes for colonialism, as it goes for even racism. And we don't consciously, we're like, oh, I see what you're saying when, I was there. And I'm sure that, we don't consciously perpetuate many of these things, but unconsciously, sometimes we do. And we have to be ready to observe that and not feel guilty about it, but just observe it and be okay with being called out, and not react, but, be able to transform that and be, because we all want to, we all want to be better people on this earth. But there are a lot of people that consciously or unconsciously are perpetuating these things.
Yeah, 100% agree with you, and I think that's a really great point that we arrived to. Ivan, it's been a real pleasure, man. I just understanding a little bit more about your background and your upbringing and your passion for activism and raising more awareness on the efforts that are happening. I really liked what you shared about your vision for bridging these different regions of the Americas and making people aware of what's happening, because it's so important, so critical. And I know you have some projects that you're working on that aren't quite launched at the moment that we're recording this episode, but I want to give you some space to speak about them. Before we do that, we'll finish on that note. I've got a few lightning round questions for you if you're ready for it.
Okay, let's do it.
All right. So real quick, short responses. What is one thing you've learned that you wish you knew when you were 18?
One thing I've learned that I wish I knew when I was 18. Well, regarding this part about men's work and being a man, I think when I was 18, I wasn't really. I was kind of feeling that the way that society painted being a man was something that was purely coming out of the patriarchal construction and programming. And it's something that I was like, I want nothing to do with that. And now I feel proud about being a man. I feel that being a man is not, I think I had maybe carried a lot of guilt because of the upbringing. Now I feel, no, being a man is something beautiful, and we have a lot to share with the world. And we have a lot of medicine to bring to the world. And we are powerful, and we are beautiful, and we have a lot to share. So that's something I wish I knew before when I was 18.
All right. Then what do you think is the single most important value to have as a man, if you could only choose one?
Value that we could have, if I could only choose one value, it would be value. You got me here.
Let me ask you a little bit differently. What is the one most important thing that you think about when you live your life that you try to stay focused on? You're like, as long as I continue to be like this, then I'm good.
Well, for me, it's freedom. I've always been a freedom seeker. I'm an Aquarian. I can't be put into boxes, and I don't like categories and boxes and structure, and I will always break away from that. And so freedom.
Awesome. I like that one. All right, Ivan. Well, please, I know that you said whatever projects you have going on, you're going to put them into your Instagram profile so people can access it. But wherever you want to tell people to go to check you out, make sure you mention your Instagram handle and anything else you want to say so people can find out about what you're involved in.
Yeah, thank you. So my Instagram handle is Ivan Kuchansum. That's IVAN KUXANSUM. And right now I'm involved with an organization called the Indigenous Medicine Conservation Fund. And by the time this podcast come out, we'll probably have the Grow Medicine campaign out, which is a campaign to support different Indigenous people's efforts in the preservation of their biocultural diversity. And these are mostly communities that are preserving culture and practices related to sacred medicines. That is ayahuasca, peyote, iboga, the toad medicine. So maybe people out there that have been in contact with any of these medicines. And these are ways that which we can give back to the community so that they can help protect their culture and the territories where these medicines grow. In the case of peyote, for example, it's in danger of extinction. So anybody that's taking peyote, even in ceremonies, it's not being regenerated. It's a plant that's in danger of extinction. It takes more than 40, 50 years to reach an adult size. So it's disappearing. So with Grow Medicine campaign, we are helping to create all the possibilities so that Indigenous people can help grow their medicine and have the possibility and even the legal possibility to grow. Keep the same for ayahuasca and other, and you will have a lot of information there. Grow Medicine, we'll have the link there. I'll have it in my Instagram handle, and I think here in the podcast as well. The link will be out there so that people can see that campaign, this organization that I'm working with, and also I am right now part of the Voices of Amerikua. I'm focusing on creating an NFT art project. So those of you out there that know about NFTs, that are interested in NFTs, this project is to visibilize and support the work of assassinated Indigenous leaders and activists. Most of them are coming from the Americas. The project is called Defensores, and it's the defenders. Mexico, Colombia, Brazil has the highest amount of assassinated activists and Indigenous leaders in the world. The numbers have reached every year. We have the highest numbers in the world, and it keep on going up. So it is because many of them are working actively, like I said, in protecting rivers, ocean, mountains, and actively working to stop big extractivism industries and put their life in danger. And so this is a way to keep their faces, their names, to bring them, to not forget them for what they did, and to bring attention to the work that they were doing, to the campaigns that they were supporting, to the territories that they were protecting, and to the organizations that they were working with, and that we will be donating part of the raised funds of these to the portraits. Different artists are participating, doing different portraits. The money will go to the different campaigns and also to the artists and to the project itself to keep going. So this is called Defensores, and you will see there the link in my Instagram, so you can see the art and support and participate. And if you're an artist and you want to participate as well, please contact us. So yeah.
Beautiful. Ivan, it's such a pleasure, man. Thank you for sharing your perspectives, your history, your work. I'm really glad that we got put in contact. It's great to get to understand you and your journey a little bit more. And I look forward to following up on those projects that you have going on, man. Sounds like you're doing some beautiful work in the world, and I wish you the best of luck.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me, and really, really great to share this time with you here.